Ja, god morgon alla seminariedeltagare och välkomna till det här seminariet Utopins pris och ideologins betydelse med professor Johann Chapoutot som vi snart ska lyssna på. And this will be the only sentence I say in Swedish, so I will turn over to English now. So first let me tell you all that it's a great pleasure for us to welcome our special guest, Johann Chapoutot, to the Living History Forum, even though it's on this digital platform this time. I am the director of the Living History Forum, and my name is Caroline Källner. And as most of you are aware of, the Living History Forum has the government's assignment to inspire and facilitate activities all over Sweden on the Holocaust Remembrance Day. Each year, we choose a special theme for the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And this year, we chose to focus on the issues of utopic thinking and the dangers connected with this. And what could be learned from the Holocaust? The name of our theme this year is The Cost of Utopia. And ideas of utopia or strong ideologic beliefs is not necessarily something bad. On the opposite, an ideology, a way to look on life, a way to interpret our society, to look at our history, and not least a way to dream about the future, is mostly an important part of our life and serves as a guide for many choices in life. But ideas of a dream society will also come with risks if democratic values and respect of equal rights and dignity is forgotten. So to help us reflect on these issues, we have invited our special guest, Johann Chapoutot, and he will soon have a deeper introduction by Karin Kvist-Gevertz from an academic perspective. So we are really looking forward to listen to you and reflect together about these issues. So welcome, and I will hand over to you, Karin.
Thank you so much, Caroline. The sound is okay. A thumbs up or so? If yes, everybody's nodding. Okay, thank you. Perfect. My name is Karin Kvist-Gevertz, and I will moderate the seminar today and introduce the lecture. First, I'd like to thank the Living History Forum for inviting me to give this introduction to Professor Johann Chapoutot's online lecture, The Price of Utopia and the Meaning of Ideology, Utopins pris och ideologins betydelse in Swedish. And like Caroline, I wish to warmly welcome you, Professor Chapoutot, and to say that I look forward to your lecture. But before I start, I will give all of you who have joined us today some practical details on the seminar with regard to time and moderation. Most of you are used to Zoom by now, but as a friendly reminder, I ask you to please mute your microphone during the lecture, but I urge you to keep your video camera on. Although we would have all preferred to meet in person, second best is to actually see each other, so please consider leaving your camera on. Time-wise, the seminar takes place in between 10 and 11:40. I will start by giving a short introduction, and at approximately 10:20, 20 minutes past 10, Professor Chapoutot will begin his lecture, and he has about 15 minutes for his speech, and by then it should be 10 past 11 or so, which will give us about 30 minutes for questions from the audience and discussion. I urge you to take this opportunity to ask a question and engage with one of the world's most interesting scholars, as you don't get this chance every day. If you like to pose a question, I ask you to please do so in using the chat, and I will ask your questions to Professor Chapoutot after he has given his lecture. So after the round of questions, the seminar ends at 11:40, and I will then give the floor back to Caroline Källner at the Living History Forum, who will end the seminar. So now that we have dealt with all the practicalities, let's move on to the interesting part, the lecture and the mindset of the perpetrators. So some of you might know me already, but for those of you who don't know me, I'll just give a short introduction of me and my research. My name is Karin Kvist-Gevers. I am an associate professor of history, docent in Swedish, and the director of the IHRS, the Institute for Holocaust Research in Sweden, or Svenska institutet för Förintelseforskning in Swedish, which is a newly founded research institute with the task to conduct comprehensive and nuanced research on all aspects concerning the Holocaust, focusing on material and topics relevant to Sweden. You can read more about the institute on our webpage, ihrs.se. I am a Swedish Holocaust historian, and in my research, I have not studied the mindset of the perpetrator, but the mindset of the Swedish bureaucrats who was in charge of the refugee policy. And like Professor Chapoutot, I have dig deep into the archives and studied a lot of documents as well as protocols and permits to stay in Sweden, because I share the idea that the primary sources and empirical studies are important for us historians in order to gain a better understanding and a deeper knowledge of what actually happened. It is our task to get the history right, as Michael Maris put it. I have studied the laws and policies as well as the practical outcomes of Swedish refugee policy towards the Jewish refugees. And since the Nazi policy, before the beginning of the final solution of the Jewish question, strived towards forced migration, this meant that Jews could have found a safe haven in Sweden if they would receive a permit to stay or later an entry visa. The Swedish bureaucrats viewed themselves as non-biased and objective state officials, and they often emphasized that they were not anti-Semites or Nazis. Despite what they said, I showed that there were nevertheless, or most of them, influenced by anti-Semitism and often expressed anti-Semitic perceptions. This meant that they believed that there was a Jewish problem, and they held the perception that there was no anti-Semitism in Sweden, but at the same time, they feared that anti-Semitism would rise if too many, as they put it, Jews were to be let into Sweden. The borders were never closed to Sweden, but in my dissertation, I showed that it was much harder for a person who was categorized as a Jew than for a non-Jew to enter Sweden. And to explain this, I think we should imagine anti-Semitism as the background noise, something that was there and that was seen as something normal within society, as long as you weren't an outspoken Nazi or an anti-Semite. In my research, I have studied anti-Semitism in Sweden, Holocaust memory culture in Sweden, and early writings about the Holocaust in books, memoirs, etc., printed in Swedish in the early post-war years. Although I haven't studied the perpetrators as Professor Chapoutot, I have dealt a lot with how we can explain the Holocaust in my teaching. And that question has been important for Holocaust historians ever since the end of the Second World War. Historians have debated whether it was at all possible to understand and explain the Holocaust. Some have argued that the Holocaust was a unique event in history because of its cruelty and evil, and that it could not be explained, while others have argued that it was an unprecedented event, but since it was made by humans, it can also be explained and compared to other events in history, as is the task of the historian. Some of you are very familiar with the debate about intentionalism and functionalism, but for those of you who are not, I will give you a short recap. The intentionalists would argue that it was the intentions by the perpetrators, the Nazis, which explains the Holocaust, and they emphasize the importance of anti-Semitism. They argue that there was a master plan all along, or an intention to murder the Jews, and that these intentions can be seen already in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, or Min Kamp på svenska. They argue that the Holocaust was decided from above and that they focus on intentions and actors and see Hitler as the most important actor or perpetrator. The functionalists would argue that we haven't yet found such an order or master plan, and that the Holocaust was not due to an order from above, but came from below within the ranks of German bureaucracy. Functionalists urge the importance of structures and tone down the importance of anti-Semitism. In short, the debate deals with the question whether the road to Auschwitz was straight or crooked. Was there a plan from the beginning, or did the Nazis try to solve the Jewish problem in different ways, which over time turned into more radical solutions, until the final solution of the Jewish question appeared as the only solution? I believe that in the public debate, when trying to understand the Holocaust, the debate tends to focus on the means and not the goal. På medlen och inte på målet. We look at photos of the main gate to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which today has become a symbol of the Holocaust. And when looking at an extermination camp, it is indeed difficult to understand how this could be the goal of the perpetrators. But what if we look in the wrong direction? What if we ask the wrong question? Was Auschwitz the goal of the Third Reich? No, the final solution was not the goal of the Nazi policy. It was a means to reach the goal. The goal was not death, but life. The goal was to create a new society. Professor Chapoutot has, in his research, engaged in this debate on how we can understand the Holocaust and why it happened. He argues that a key question is to understand the Nazis' worldview and how they explained it to themselves. In order to do so, he has gone through primary sources, and in these he has found the ideas of the origins of the German race, where ideas on Blut and Boden, blood and soil, blod och jord in Swedish, was to replace foreign ideas and the norms, and where the idea of the folk, the people, or folket in Swedish, and Volksgemeinschaft, folkgemenskap in Swedish, was more important than the individual and more important than humanity. Professor Chapoutot has dug deep into the sources and tried to understand the words and ideas, and he urges us to take these words seriously. The Nazis meant what they wrote. And perhaps we shouldn't find that so surprising after all, because the ideas they believed in did not arise with Nazism. They were a mixture of widely held beliefs and ideas which already existed in society, but they were radicalized and put into actions and violence in a way that the world hadn't seen before. Professor Chapoutot emphasizes that the Nazi ideas on race and blood found their mark, en resonansbotten in Swedish, which helped explain experiences that people had with the other. And these explanations provided them with meaning. When thinking about the mindset of the perpetrator and the utopia they wanted to create, Professor Chapoutot reminds us that other nations also strived to create the good society. Sweden or the United States, for instance. But one important difference was that neither Sweden nor the US wanted to solve problems in society by the final solution, by mass murder. The Nazis applauded themselves for being the first to have the stamina, the guts to do it. And by these words, I am very glad and honored to introduce Dr. Johann Chapoutot, who is a professor of modern history at the University of Sorbonne in France. He is a specialist in German history, and among his publications are The Law of Blood, Thinking and Acting Like a Nazi from 2018, Greeks, Romans, Germans, How the Nazis Usurped Europe's Classical Path, published in 2016, and Free to Obey, Nazism and Management, published in French in 2020, and it will be published in English this year, which we look forward to. Professor Chapoutot books are translated into several languages and distinguished by numerous French and international awards, such as the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research in 2015. Warmly welcome, Professor Chapoutot. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gewertz, for this very warm and very rich introduction, which goes far beyond what I'm trying to do and what I'm going to say, because you put in a very interesting perspective our research as Holocaust scholars or as specialists for the Nazi regime, which is not quite the same thing, actually, although it can be assimilated in the broad public opinion. Thank you very much for having me among you for this special week of remembrance and commemoration of the liberation of the camps. We are commemorating the day on January 27th when the Soviet army entered the premises of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and this day was chosen as a day of commemoration for the crimes of the Nazi regime in concentration camps and extermination facilities, which were distinct from each other. But as we know, Auschwitz-Birkenau was both, and a very complex site and a very complex place. Your introduction, Karin, was extremely rich, and you emphasized in your little talk the necessity of working on sources, primary sources, Primärquellen in German, as opposed to historiography, Sekundärliteratur in German. Sources which imply, of course, the mastery of languages and foreign languages. It is not possible to seriously study the Nazi period and the Holocaust, the Shoah, without knowing German, of course. English, because it's the lingua franca of science today, I would add, alas, and other languages like Polish, Russian, and Yiddish, languages from the east of Europe, where the vast majority of crimes took place. Sources, languages, this gives us a hint at the fact that there is another language which is important in this history, which is the Nazi language, as a metaphor for the Nazi worldview, the Nazi mindset. It's very difficult to understand that what we perceive today, of course, and fortunately, I would say, what we perceive today as a logoria, as an unorganized language, words that were shouted during political meetings and rallies, absurd speeches held by violent men screaming from their tribune to the public. Those are the images we have from Hitler and from the other people who were the upper hierarchy of the Nazi regime. It's very difficult for us to understand that those words, that logoria, was in fact a logos, that is to say, an organized language, an organized worldview, what the Nazis would call Weltanschauung, a very important word, Weltanschauung, which is not a Nazi expression by itself, because it was a technical term of the philosophy of the 19th century, but like many other words of the German languages, it was taken over and transformed by the Nazis. This Weltanschauung, this worldview, this vision of the world was extremely important, because it was that worldview that gave them the norms, the values, the ideas, the justification to commit things that we think today could not have been committed by human beings. And actually, this is a reaction we often have, and the public opinion often has, when you look at public debates about National Socialism. You always hear the words animals, barbarians, crazy people, sick people. And this is, of course, the first obvious reaction we do have as human beings and as citizens, because it's obvious that we as human beings, as citizens of the 21st century, could not even think about committing 1/100th of what was done by any policeman, German policeman on the Eastern Front, a member of the Einsatzgruppen. That's obvious. The second reason why we do have a problem with the German, not the German, but the Nazi language as the worldview, is that the Nazi violence and their crimes were so numerous and so criminal in their extent and in their intensity, that they are an invitation to silence. Because we are shocked whenever we meet those crimes, even as a trained historian who is used to such sources and such deeds, we cannot help but being shocked and horrified by what we read in our archives. So it's an invitation to silence, the silence of meditation, the silence of reflection, deep philosophical questions about humanity, because National Socialism might have been the crime against humanity per se, actually, because it negated the very idea of humanity in its victims, and because maybe it made us despair about humanity and the very existence of humanity. So the silence of meditation, of philosophical reflection, maybe the silence of prayer for priests and pastors and rabbis, of course, and the meditation and the silence of mourning in any case. Sometimes it's extremely difficult to read some sources. As far as I'm concerned, I'm very sensitive about the issue of children. So whenever there are children involved in the sources, I have problems dealing with the sources. Okay, so that's the first and perfectly understandable reaction to all this. The Nazis were not human beings. They didn't have a language, and our own language is eradicated by the sideration and the shock we have in front of the sources, in front of the extent and the intensity of the crimes they committed. So much ado about silence, actually, and I'm speaking much, so we do speak. We do speak. And we do write, especially on that period and especially on that question. There are more than 40,000 books written and published about the history of Nazi Germany and the Shoah. And it goes up and counting every week. So why do we speak and why do we write? Because history as social science has things to say about what happened beyond mourning, beyond surprise, beyond shock and consideration. Social sciences have some things to say about what happened when they show us how, in a very concrete way, on a very grassroots level, things happened. Crimes do not come from anywhere and do not happen out of the blue. Social sciences and history as a social science has shown that the massive crimes of genocide happen in a context of social interactions, when we can state and we can see that the victims and the perpetrators are connected. Maybe not the German policeman from Hamburg shooting people in Poland. They were not connected before. But the victims, the Polish Jews who were shot by the 101st Police Reserve Division studied by Peter Browning, for instance, that those victims were known to their neighbors, to their co-citizens in the village, and they were spotted, traced down, and denounced by them to the Polish collaborators and to the German police. It's a fact that you encounter in every context of genocide. Jan Gross, the famous Polish historian, has shown it very well in his book entitled The Neighbors for Poland. Hélène Dumas has shown it in the context of Rwanda in 1994. She wrote a fantastic book called Genocide in the Village, where she shows the importance of grassroots social interactions. And you can see the same thing about the Saint-Barthélemy in France in 1572, in the 16th century, when the Protestants of Paris here were killed in thousands by the Catholic mob, we used to say, but actually it was not the mob. It was not that vague idea of a mob. It was precise persons actually belonging to the middle or the upper class who knew exactly the victims, who knew where they were, and who killed them for religious reasons, of course, but also for material reasons, because there was property to be seized. There were Catholic wives to be married again, etc., etc. The same things can be seen in the way the German Jews were treated, the Polish Jews and the Jews on the Eastern Front. So history has things to say to us, social history and cultural history as well. And this is where I'm coming back to this idea of logos as opposed to logoria. The logoria is the spectacle and the very unpleasant spectacle we encounter whenever we see a broadcast documentary on this period. Hitler yelling from the tribune in a very rough language, which means nothing, an animal. But actually it was not an animal. That was a logos, an organized worldview. It was a project, it was a vision of history, and it was a promise to, and a plan to develop something else. It was a utopia, actually. And I'm perfectly aware that this word is a provocation, because utopias are something positive in our understanding. We need utopias, we love utopias, and we have a very understandable difficulty to understand that people in Germany in the 1930s thought and found that National Socialism, this dictatorship, this regime, was good. Good for them in a material way, in a psychological way, and good for their future. It was good in a material way. Social historians in Germany have shown it 1,000 times. The Nazi period was a period of profit, material profit, material well-being for the Germans. Full employment, investments, the war machine, the infrastructures, giving jobs and work to the Germans, so that the first slogan, the most important slogan of the Nazi party at the end of the 1920s, Freiheit und Brot, was fulfilled. The promise was fulfilled. And the Shoah was a good deal as well for the Germans, because whenever a Jewish family disappeared from a building, there was stuff, there were goods, there were objects to be acquired in a very cheap way. Whenever a family disappeared, a piano, kitchen tools, books were to be bought in auctions at the bottom of the building on the very same day or the day after. And sometimes, for the lucky ones, the apartment too was to be had in a very cheap way. So that's for the material satisfaction of the Germans. There was also another kind of satisfaction of another nature, not a material, but a psychological or an intellectual satisfaction. And this is something I will stress upon now, because it more specifically connects with my research. Let's start by seeing that National Socialism as a political ideology, as a political doctrine, I would say as a political religion, actually, because it went far beyond what political doctrines had said and done in the 19th century. It took into account many more questions than the classical political doctrines of the 19th century. That's why National Socialism, as well as fascism or Stalinism, were so successful, because they gave something more than liberalism, for instance. They didn't deal only with the question of power, of riches, classical doctrinal political questions. They went far beyond, addressing the questions of identity, of life, of death, of the meaning of history, the meaning of your life in this world. That was very powerful. So National Socialism as a political ideology, or as a political culture, as a political religion, was first of all a project, a very structured and organized project. And this is something I would like to stress upon first. The Nazis wanted to get rid of the French Revolution. This is something they said all the time. They hated the French Revolution. They hated 1789. They saw in 1789, in the French Revolution, the source of all evil for contemporary history. Joseph Goebbels, the newly nominated minister of culture, of Propaganda und Volksaufklärung, propaganda and culture, said on radio on April the 1st, 1933, we want to eradicate 1789 out of history, period. We want to eradicate 1789 out of history. Alfred Rosenberg, who was in charge of the doctrinal and intellectual work inside the Nazi Party, said, we want to close the parenthesis of 150 years of mistakes and errors. 150 years of mistakes and errors. That is to say, a period that began in the 1780s in France with the French Revolution should come to an end with the new revolution, that of blood, that of science, that of racism and race, that was characteristic for National Socialism. After the International Revolution of the French, which was followed by other international revolutions, 1917 in Russia, or 1871 again in Paris Commune, there was to be a national revolution, the Nationale Revolution in Germany, based on the folk as a closed entity, based on the race and based on science. That's the problem with the modern world and with the French Revolution for the Nazis. It is based on nothing. It is based on dreams and delusions. The fundament of the French Revolution and its vision of history is the free citizen, the free individual who creates a society. But there is no such thing as society. And here I'm not quoting Margaret Thatcher, I'm quoting the Nazis. There is no such thing as society. There are only communities. A society is not a community. A community is something natural, coined and shaped by history and tradition. The community is something that gives you a meaning and a direction in life. Whereas a society is quite the opposite. A society is not made by tradition or by God or by blood. A society is made by you, by the citizen, the free citizen. But the free citizen does not exist, actually, for the Nazis. And by saying that, they were not being very original, actually. They were just repeating what the enemies of the French Revolution had been saying for centuries, that there is no freedom, there is no individual, there is no citizen, there is no society. People would say that in France, as soon as the 1790s, the counter-revolution, would repeat it throughout the 19th century, especially in France, because it was in France where those ideas were so powerful and were giving a fundament and a meaning to a new regime, the Republic. And those ideas spread all over Europe and all over the Western world to criticize the very idea of democracy and of society. So for the Nazis, but by saying that they were only the grandchildren of the counter-revolution and the children of Maurice Barrès, for instance, in France, by saying that, the Nazis were saying that the political group, the human group, is not based upon liberty or freedom. It's based upon determination and coercion. So a political dictatorship is fine because our identity is not freedom, it's coercion, it's determination by science, by blood, by biology. There is no such thing as liberty or freedom in the world. Everything in nature shows the opposite. The laws of gravity, for instance, show that any object is subjected to laws of nature. It is true in physics, it is true in biology as well. And when I say that, I remember us that the Nazis were the sons of the age of science. The 19th century, where science was so powerful, physics, chemistry, biology, zoology, ethology, medicine, and where the very idea of determination, laws of nature, was so important in shaping our modern worldview and the worldview, political worldview of the enemies of democracy, which can be paradoxical in our view because we tend to associate science, reason, and democracy, of course. And that's one side of the Enlightenment. The other side being that it can give arguments and ideas to the enemies of democracy. There is no such thing as freedom in nature. So when the French said liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, fraternity, they were absolutely wrong as far as freedom is concerned. It's absurd. And the Nazis would repeat it. This society that emanated from the French Revolution is absurd. It's based on thin air, on nothing. A second thing did not exist in nature, which is equality. Liberté, égalité. There is no equality in nature. Nature is all about differences, hierarchies between individuals and between groups, between races. And here it's very important to stress that race and racism were not prejudices, were not vague ideas, but were part of a scientific vision of the world. Racial anthropology, die Rassenkunde, l'anthropologie raciale, was a science in the 19th century. A science taught here at the Sorbonne, a science taught at the Museum d'Histoire Naturelle, here in Paris or in London or in Stockholm, everywhere. It was obvious that you could name, classify, and class human beings as well as you did with animals, stones, plants, what have you. The racial anthropology of those days, which the Nazis inherited because it was common sense, that racial anthropology was a pure zoology applied to humans. And it was okay to do that. It was a perfect way of practicing science, differentiating, nominating, and building hierarchies and classifications. That was okay. So that there was no equality in nature for the Nazis. They were not the only ones to say that, because the big colonial empires of Europe in those days were saying the same thing. What was the ultimate justification for the French or the English or the Portuguese or the Spaniards or the Belgians to go to Africa and to Asia and to submit peoples and vast territories? The ultimate justification was that those territories were terrae nullius, territories that belonged to nobody. Because in Africa, there were Africans, and Africans were not really human beings. they were some kinds of evolved animals that did not have a civilization comparable to Europe. And so it was perfectly justified to enslave them. In the best case, as the French would say and would boast, to enlighten them, to enlighten the Black Continent with the virtues and the benefits of French and European culture. How nice and how philanthropic. So no equality between races, of course, and no equality within a group where individuals are differentiated according to their performance. This is a very important word in the Nazi worldview. The word Leistung, I guess in Swedish it's quite the same one. Leisten in German means to do and to achieve, to perform. And the Leistung means performance, rentability, return on equity, everything that has to do with performance of any kind, in sports, in demography, in economy, in wars. And each individual for the Nazis had a different Leistung according to its brain, to his brain or to his body, to his strength. And the value of the individual was dependent upon the Leistung. There were leistungsfähige Menschen, so people who were able to perform, and leistungsunfähige Menschen, unable to perform. And the leistungsunfähige Menschen were, I quote, lebensunwerte Leben, life that were not worth living, because you were not able to give back to the community what the community had given to you when you were a child, for instance, dependent upon the community. So when you are a child, of course, you are given everything, but then you are meant to give back in terms of sports, of children, of economic production, of combat. Leistungsunfähige Menschen, people who are unable to perform within the German race, were not supposed to live. And in fact, they were excluded from the cycle of procreation as soon as July 1933 by the laws of sterilization. And then in the framework of the Aktion T4, they were purely and simply killed. 400,000 people were sterilized in 12 years, and 200,000 people were killed after 1939. So no equality. That idea of Leistung and an equality based upon performance was not a Nazi idea. It was an idea that was one of the pillars of social Darwinism, actually. Social Darwinism had been teaching, as soon as the second half of the 19th century, that people were caught within nature, and that nature was basically war. Nature is struggle for life, is selection of the fittest, and is survival of the fittest. That idea, which was again common sense among elites in the Western world since the second half of the 19th century, because it was the fundament of capitalism and of colonization, That idea was inherited by the Nazis as well. The third idea that was perfectly absurd in the eyes of the Nazis was that the idea of fraternity. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. There is no such thing as fraternity in the world, because fraternity, as the etymology says, comes from frater, from brother, Bruder, frère. So it implies that there is a human family, which we are all part of. But again, there is no human family, there is no human race, there is no humanity for the Nazis. There are races that are perfectly comparable to animal species. The human races are animal species. The German race is a special species, as well as the Slavs, or the blacks, or the Latin populations of Southern Europe, and what have you. The particular kind of racism that was acknowledged and that was promoted by the Nazis was a polygenic racism. A polygenic racism that said that the origins of the different races were different. There was no common origin to a human species. There was no such thing. We did not descend from a common ancestor. The blacks descended from a particular species, as well as the Germans, etc., etc. There were no links between the different races. That's why the Nazis were especially worried by the existence of what they called Rassenbastarde, racial bastards, mongrels. Because when you defend in zoology that there is no common origin to the different animal species, you can see that because different animals and different species cannot have common children, but human races can. So it's always a nightmare for racists to see that sexual intercourses are possible and lead to fertility. That's a nightmare for racists everywhere. Mischlinge, as the Nazis would say, were a nightmare, because at first they were the proof that the polygenic racism was absurd. So so much for the political project of the Nazis. It was a radical refutation of the world that had been born since the French Revolution, a radical refutation of society, freedom, and the values of the modern world, equality and fraternity. As opposed to society, Gesellschaft, there was a community, Gemeinschaft, Volksgemeinschaft, community of the people. The Nazis would speak of Gemeinschaft in many ways. Volksgemeinschaft, Kampfgemeinschaft, a community of combat. Leistungsgemeinschaft, a community of performance, as well as far as sports and economics are concerned, etc., etc. A Gemeinschaft is something that is the kind of group that gives a meaning to you and to your life. Whereas society is quite the opposite. You, as a free individual, choose to be part of it and give its meaning to that kind of political group. So back to communities, back to biology, back to science. And that's very important. It was a claim that was very important for the Nazis. The idea of community opposed to society was not new. It was already defended by the counter-revolutionary at the end of the 18th century. But in those days, it was based upon God. God had created a community. God had given the power to the King of France, etc., etc. Quite on the contrary, they said that God was no longer acceptable as a fundament because Europe was stuck in a movement of dechristianization. But science gave its justification to the idea of community, because the community of the German people was not based upon God or God's will, but upon blood, biology. That's why Hitler would say in two of his speeches that National Socialism was applied biology, applied science, angewandte Biologie, angewandte Rassenkunde, applied science, applied biology. And so, of course, it conferred to the decisions of the Nazis the certainty and the necessity of science. You could not argue with them because they were right. What they said, what they told, what they decided was told and said and decided by nature through science, period. So it was another way of closing the parenthesis of the French Revolution. There is no debate anymore. There is nothing to debate, actually, because everything is set in necessity, in an apodictic way, so to say, by science, by nature. That political project, and that would be my second point, that political project was based upon a vision of history. And I shall be more brief here. That vision of history by the Nazis was, first of all, based upon race. And this is something we already discussed. It was based upon race. And race, of course, was not a bias, was not a prejudice, it was a scientific concept. And the Nazi vision of history was also based upon conspiracy and conspiracy theories. We keep hearing about conspiracy theories today, thanks to the new means of communication, the new structures of communication, the web 2.0, social networks. We saw the catastrophic effects of conspiracy theories in the United States the past 5 or 6 years, and it's not over yet, far from it. National Socialism can be seen as the conspiracy theory per se or per excellency, actually, because everything is based upon the idea that there are races, there is a racial war, structuring history. History is war, and races fight each other, like animal species, for the mastering of a territory, for their nutrition, for their survival. Each race fights for its Lebensraum, its biotope. And the most important war throughout history is actually a war opposing the German race, or the Nordic Germanic race, which comes from the north, and which spread over Europe in prehistoric times. As the Nazis said, Germanic tribes immigrating from the north to the south and creating the prestigious civilizations of ancient Mediterranean. Greece was a creation of the Germans. Rome was a creation of the Germans, which is absolutely preposterous in our ears, but was not in those days. Because as soon as the 19th century, the thesis or the hypothesis of the Nordic origin of the Greeks and the Romans had been taken very seriously by archaeologists and scientists in European universities. It was very difficult for many people to accept that European civilization, Greece and Rome, came from Asia, because the Indo-European logic is that tribes came from Asia, from India, and colonized Europe. It was unacceptable for white supremacists of Europe in the 19th century. Why not considering another origin, which was not the East, ex oriente lux, but the North, ex septentrione lux? And of course, that was a solution, an idea, vision of history that was much more comfortable for many people in Europe, actually. We, as Europeans, we do not come from Asia. We come from the north, Scandinavia, the north of Germany, what have you. So that idea was very strongly emphasized and spread during Nazi Germany and taught everywhere, actually, in universities, in schools, in school books, everywhere. So the German race, which has many names, Nordic Germanic race, Nordic race, German race, Germanische Rasse, etc., gave birth to civilization, that's for sure. And in front of it, there were the exact opposite of civilization, the destroyers of everything, the Jews. Once again, the Nazis did not invent that. They inherited that idea, that in front of the cosmos and logos of the Germans, who gave birth to civilization, language, mathematics, philosophy, which gave birth to a whole organized world, Apollo, so to say. There was Dionysos, a principle of destruction, of passion and destruction, coming not from the north, where people are cool and well-balanced, but from the south and from the east, where people are crazy because of the sun, because of the heat. They are disorganized. And they want to destroy everything the North created, because they are jealous, period. That's simple. They are jealous. And they are sick, because people in the South and in the East are sick. And because the Jews are sick. Why? Because the Jews are not a race. They are not a race. They are a non-race or an anti-race. Eine Unrasse, eine Gegenrasse. They are a mixing of different types of blood. Arabs, Negroes, as they said, Armenoids, Palestinians, all sorts of horrible things coming from the south and converging into that sewer. This is something Alfred Rosenberg said. the Jews are a sewer, actually, eine Kloake, because they are a mixture of different types of blood, and hence they are sick. The sound people, sound and healthy people, are the people who are of one piece biologically. But as soon as you are mixed with somebody else, you get sick, physically and mentally. Schizophrenia is a biological disease. You have two personalities because you have two races in yourself, period. So that's why the Jews are so eager to attack and to destroy the Germans. It's very important to stress upon that, because at the core of Nazi ideology is the idea that the Germans are the victims. They are being attacked. They are being besieged. They are being aimed at by the Jews. It's an old idea in German history, which dates back from the 17th century, at least from the times of the 30 years war. The idea that Germans and Germany are vulnerable, are under attack, are under siege, are to be destroyed by a world of enemies. Eine Welt von Feinden, a world of enemies. Sperrfeuer Deutschland, as they said during the First World War. There is a standing machine gun fire against Germany from all over the places, from every point on the map against Germany. They, the outside world, want to destroy us because we are the best, and because they are manipulated by the Jews. That's the other problem with the Jews. They are everywhere, as anti-Semites are used to saying. They are everywhere. They're in Moscow as communists. They are in London and in Washington and in New York as capitalists and Democrats. They are everywhere. There is a horrible conspiration of the Jews against the Germans, and there has been a horrible conspiration for millenniaries. I stumbled one day upon a history handbook of the Nazi Party called 6,000 Jahre Rassenkampf, 6,000 years of racial war. And the next chapter was called 6,000 Jahre jüdischer Hass, 6,000 years of Jewish hatred, hatred against us. The subversion and inversion of realities is a constant characteristic of the Nazi worldview. When the Nazis speak about pogroms, they mean the massacres decided by the Jews against the Germans. This is a pogrom. When they speak about Vernichtung, they speak about the horrible endeavor of the Jews against the Germans, etc., etc. So there is a horrible conspiracy, which then materializes in local conspiracies throughout history. The Greeks, who were Germans, were confronted with the Persians, who were a mixture of southern and eastern people led by the Jews. The Greeks won, because the Greeks are Germans, they are the best. The Romans were attacked by Carthago and the Carthaginians, who were Jews, according to the Nazis. And the Romans won because they were Germans, they were the best. And so the solution found by the Jews to defeat Rome was a conspiracy called Christianity. Christianity was a political doctrine of a new kind, which was based upon equality. Everybody is equal in the eyes of God, of dignity of everybody, and it was a universal doctrine aimed at everybody in the world. As St. Paul said, there is no Greek, no Roman, no Jew anymore. There are only children of God. That idea of Christianity killed the Roman world, which was a racial empire based upon the difference between the citizens and the others, the patricians and the plebeians, the patricians being the good, pure Germanic blood, and the plebeians being the other population of the empire, etc., etc. Christianity was the communism of antiquity, and that killed, destroyed the Roman Empire. In recent days, there is a new version of that Jewish conspiracy, which is not Christianity anymore, it is communism. Like Christianity, a universal doctrine based on the equal dignity and equal value of everybody in the world. That is the exact contrary to a racial order that was supposed to be the order of the Roman German Empire and of the German Reich today. Last point of this brief presentation, we see that history for the Nazis is a valley of death, a valley of problems and of attacks against the German race. There is a constant deploration of what history is. The Germans are the victims, they are being attacked, their territory is invaded in the 17th century, then in the 19th century, then there is the First World War. So it's an ongoing and continuing series of proof, ordeals, and unhappy events. What the Nazis proposed to the Germans was simply to get out of history, to leave the ground of history for something else. And here we enter the realm of utopia. When the Nazis spoke about a Reich, an empire that would last 1,000 years, when they spoke about das tausendjährige Reich, they were referring, of course, to Christian millenarism, Christian eschatology, but they were meaning it by saying we are offering you 1,000 years of prosperity and peace and happiness. They were saying that the German people was leaving the world of history, which is a world of unhappiness, of wars, of decadency, of degeneration, etc., to go to the sure ground of a colonial empire that would be built in the East, where the Germans would grow many children, would nourish them, and would live in eternity in peace. That idea was not a mere dream. It was also a very precise and technocratic endeavor. There were people, as soon as 1931, within the SS, in the Rasse- und Siedlungshauptamt, in the Office of Race and Colonization, then after 1939, in the RKF, Reichskommissariat für die Festigung deutschen Volkstums, the office of the Reich for the reinforcement of the Germanic race. There were people who were economists, geographers, technocrats, policemen, officers, university professors who were concretely building the plans for that future, for the greater Germanic empire in the East, which was to be a colonial empire, like the French had one, like the English, etc., etc. Why not the Germans? And that empire would be in the East, where Germanic tribes and Germanic military orders had been spreading since the Middle Ages. That empire would be the very place of that racial utopia that the Nazis wanted for their people. And that's why National Socialism was so powerful, because it delivered goods, material goods, food in a country that had starved during the First World War. It delivered properties in the East. It delivered social progress for many people who couldn't have dreamed of such a career in their little town in the south of Germany, when suddenly they were nominated head of a district in Belarusia. They had slaves. They had vast properties. And they would have that for millenniums to come. The racial war would be put to an end. And on the sure ground of the fertile eastern soil of Ukraine, for instance, the Germans would grow crops and would raise children in quantities that were unheard before. The plans of the RKF, of the SS, were counting upon 400 million Germans, 400 million Germans within 250 years. I read a lawyer who said that 1 billion Germans would be there in 400 or 500 years. 1 billion Germans, thanks to peace and prosperity. Because in those plans, after the war in the East would be completed and won, there would be no war anymore. The Slavs would be enslaved, and the Jews would have disappeared, one way or another. One way or another. And it's very important to stress upon that fact, because at first it was unthinkable, even for the hierarchy of the Nazi regime, to kill 11 million people, because there were 11 million Jews that were counted by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Unthinkable. Technically, maybe morally. They came to that idea and to that decision very late in December 1941, with the first implementation in the spring of 1942 in the framework of the Aktion Reinhardt. But before that, the Jews would simply disappear from the biotop, from the Lebensraum of the Germans, one way or another, through deportation to Madagascar, through deportation to the Polar Circle, through immigration to anywhere. But that's another topic, and it would last a little semester to go deeper into this. This is where I will end by saying that by doing that, by trying to understand this worldview, of course we have a gratification, an intellectual and moral gratification. And of course it can be also useful in a therapeutic way. Therapists prescribe books by historians to their patients when they are second and third generation of Holocaust survivors. But beyond that, it is a way of fighting negationism, the negation of the Shoah. Because the negation of the Shoah is based upon the idea that that didn't take place, because that was impossible, and that was unthinkable. And here, when we go deeper into it, and I summarized in a very short time, around 15 years of research, of course, and reading. But when we go deeper into it, we understand that human beings could think that, want that, and implement that. And that maybe is the best, at least intellectual answer to the negation of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chapoutot, for a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, and we have 18 minutes for them, but I'm gonna tell you them one by one and see how many of these questions that we could actually elaborate on a little bit. So first question is about the ideas and worldview of the National Socialists, which you spoke a lot about in your lecture. But could you say something about the influence it had on the German society, or perhaps not society, but community, as you were saying? Obviously, Germany was a dictatorship, but you were also saying that these ideas made sense. It provided the German people with a meaning. But could you say something about that in general? Was it accepted? Do we know? Is there research about this? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, please?
Thank you for this question. It's always difficult to assess that kind of reception of ideas in a society. And it's much more interesting here to see that there wasn't any need for any reception, actually, because the ideas were common sense and were there within society, at the bottom of society. It didn't come from, from the top in a top-down relationship through propaganda, through a dictatorship. Those ideas were already down, were already at the bottom of society, were already grassroots ideas, because those were commonsensical ideas of the Western world and of Europe in those days. We are speaking about a world that was the world of colonization, okay? And the Nazis didn't say anything else. We want our own colonial empire. Africa and Asia are already full. Fair enough. We are not interested by Africa and Asia because we are biological determinists, and the sun is going to make us degenerate there. So we don't want that. We want to go on the same hemisphere at the same level, east, because in the east there are no proper people. There are Slavs, and those people did not create any civilization. We Germans did, and we are going to make the ground of Ukraine, for instance, fertile through our work. This is the old justification for colonization. So anti-Semitism was everywhere, everywhere. Racism was everywhere. Capitalism was everywhere. Social Darwinism, eugenics, common sense. What the Nazis did in the 1920s is that they bundled all this into a very powerful narrative which explained everything and which gave a perspective and solutions for the future. So we have to change the perspective and to forget about this top-down relationship through propaganda. National Socialism was not the mere alliance of a powerful microphone and a powerful police. You cannot rule a country of 70 million people with only 8,000 agents of the Gestapo. 8,000 for the whole German Reich. It doesn't work. You have to gain the conviction and the acquiescement and maybe the enthusiasm of the population for that. And it was not so difficult for them.
Thank you so much. So there are more questions. For instance, then this one. The person says, thank you for your talk. I understand your perspective as an attempt of historical empathy, understanding Nazism from within, so to speak. What do you think of using this perspective in elementary education? Do you see risks or potential? If you could elaborate on that, please.
I'm afraid I'm not very competent for that kind of questions. It's actually always a problem when when I'm invited by colleagues from high schools to speak about research, because there is research and there is the logic of research, which can go very deep and very far, and which can produce a kind of discourse that can hardly sometimes be understood by other people, and all the more by students. So I couldn't answer that question. I couldn't answer that question.
It's all right, and it's a difficult discussion, I think, or I believe, within Holocaust education as well. And also Holocaust education deals a lot with everything else but the Holocaust. So that's another problem. Yes, thank you. So there was another question, and I think this you can elaborate more on. How could the Nazis handle the fact that in nature it is the strongest race that survives? If the Jewish race or non-race was so sick, wouldn't it vanish by itself? And this, I think, is an important point. How did the Nazis view the Jew as an enemy, as strong or sick or weak? Or so, if you could elaborate a little bit on that, please.
As well as the Jews were everywhere, they were everything. Actually, they were weak and they were strong, and they were strong because of their weakness. They were physically weak, so they were shrewd, and they were nasty, and so they gained power through their shrewdness and nastiness. You can read all kinds of things like that in the Nazi literature, and more generally in the anti-Semitic literature till today, actually. There is nil novi sub sole, nothing new under the sun, and the Nazis just managed to, in a very effective way, to give a consistency and a power to those ideas.
Yes, thank you so much. So there are more questions about the material benefits of anti-Semitism and Aryanization. That would be an expropriation, of course. The question is, who collected the money from the sales of Jewish property that you mentioned?
You can find everything on that topic in the work of Frank Bayor, who is a historian, who is leading the Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung am Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich. Frank Bayer has worked specifically on the region of Hamburg and the city of Hamburg, and he shows very precisely how it went with different organizations according to the place and the time. Either it would be the party and one of its agencies, or it would be the civil administration. So that depends upon the time and the place. The structure and the functioning of the Nazi regime is not what we think. It's very much based on improvisation, local initiatives, and chaos. So it's difficult to answer that question.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned another question is about research on other groups, other victim groups than the Jewish group. So would you like to say something about you talked about the flood of books on Holocaust research, and I share that what you said, but could you say something about other categories, the Roma, the Sinti, the Gypsies, homosexuals, disabled, etc. And I think this question also resonates within the Swedish community, because here there's often a discussion within the public debate that we sort of should we shouldn't think that some groups are more important than others. And you have stressed here in your lecture the importance in the Nazi worldview of the Jew as the enemy. But could you say something about that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very important question, because it can help to differentiate the different categories of victims of the Nazis. There is one universal enemy, which is an enemy everywhere, and those are the Jews. The French Jews, the Russian Jews, the British Jews, the Dutch Jews, the Swiss Jews are enemies everywhere. And they have to be dealt with in one way or another. The handicapped and the homosexual, for instance, are not a target of the Nazis when they are outside the Germanic race. The German handicapped are a problem. The French handicapped, no problem. The German homosexuals are a problem because they prevent the birth of new children. The French homosexuals are fine. Please go ahead. There was a very famous homosexual in the government of Marshal Pétain, Abel Bonnard, the Minister of Education. It was fine. The Nazis loved him. No problem. If the French don't want to have children, fine. So you see the difference here. You have a universal target, and you have categories that are a big problem within Germany. That's for sure. The disabled, the handicapped, the sick are a problem for the race. The homosexuals are a big problem within Germany. But anywhere else, let them be. Let them exist. Unless they pose a threat or a problem. Polish citizens who were handicapped were killed by the SS in the fall of 1939 during the invasion. Why? Because they were occupying hospital beds that were needed by the German army. So they shot them, not because Polish handicapped were a problem, far from it, that's a Polish problem, but because they were occupying beds that were needed by the Wehrmacht. As far as the
so they were sort of a logistic problem or economic
Absolutely.
problem, not really a racial problem. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have the same logic about gypsies. Sinti und Roma. They were at one point, I don't remember the date exactly, but at one point they were massacred in Auschwitz. But because they were filling a barrack that was needed for newly arrived transferred people. That's it. The treatment of the Sinti und Roma is extremely incoherent by the Nazis, because at the ground of that, there was no precise specification of what the Sinti und Roma were. They were a problem, of course, like everywhere in the Western world. We don't like them, okay, till today. They were a problem, but the Nazis could not say and could not assess where they came from and what race they were part of. For some Rassenkundler, for some racial anthropologists, they were Jews, so it was, of course, much more easy to deal with them. For others, they were of ancient Germanic tribes. So there is no unified assessment of their biological nature, and hence there is no unified treatment of that category, because the category in itself did not exist.
Thank you so much. It's difficult to unmute my microphone when my picture is moving along, so it takes me a little while. So we need to round up, but I think the last question then will have to be about, you spoke about a little bit about the fact that there is no, when there is no document on or order for the Holocaust and when it took place, but when could we say that there was such an idea or order? And you define that or talk about that in December of 1941. And then there are other scholars who usually put this date somewhere else in July of 1941. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on why you see it as that?
Yeah, it's a difficult debate, and there is a fact, which is the evolution of massacres into genocide, which is not the same thing, in the summer of 1941 on the Eastern Front. Police operations by the Einsatzgruppen, which were Befriedungsaktionen, that is to say, pacification actions for the Wehrmacht by the German police, were led as soon as June the 21st, 22, 1941. And that evolved into a genocide, because they did not kill anymore only men, but children and women and elderly people as well. And an order was given orally by Himmler, who visited different sites of operations in July 1941, and gave that order to kill every Jew. But that is for the Eastern Front. And the Eastern Front is something extremely special. It's Africa for them. It's colonial ground. It's extremely dangerous. It's filled with strange creatures, the most dangerous and strange one being the Jews. The Ostjuden, Eastern Jews, which were quite different from the Westjuden. Ostjuden were religious, were poor, were rural, etc., etc. So it was much easier to kill such a different population. The Western Jews, that was another story. They were your neighbors, they were your Frontkameraden, people you had fought alongside with during the First World War, they were your friends, etc., etc. So it took more time to come to the conclusion that every other solution, Endlösung, to the Jewish question was not possible. Massive deportation to Madagascar, massive deportation to the Polar Circle. The massive deportation to Madagascar was cancelled because the Germans didn't have the means to do it technically. The deportation to the north, to Siberia and the Polar Circle, was made impossible by the counterattack of the Soviet army in October 1941. It was over. And many other factors led to the decision that the Jews of Western Europe, as well as Eastern Europe, had to be killed. And that most probably is around mid-December 1941.
Thank you so much for this, Professor Chapoutot, for your lecture and for elaborating on these different issues. I would have loved to sit here all day and listen to all your knowledge and learn more, but we have to round up. So I would like to thank you for a very, very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I would like to thank everybody who has joined today and for all the questions from the audience. Thank you so much for that. By that, I give the floor back to Caroline Schellner, the director of the Living History Forum.
Yes, and I can only agree and say thank you very much, Johann, for this interesting lecture. And I think it's given us a lot of thoughts that we would like to discuss further. Maybe you can come back to the Living History Forum in different seminars, and we will touch upon these topics again. And we also have some more events during this week. For example, we have the memorial ceremony on Thursday that will be broadcasted on SVT Forum. So please share the word, and you can also ask friends and colleagues to see this seminar on our website in a couple of days. So thank you very much for attending, and take good care. Bye.
Have a good day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.